Our next speaker is a very dear friend, a colleague, and a representative for the British people. He is a member of the Houses of Parliament. He's been the MP for Islington since 1983. He's a long-time supporter for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the CND. And he has just returned, in fact, from a parliamentary delegation to Iran with a handful of other members of Parliament from several different parties. He himself is a Labour MP, Tory MPs also went with him. And so he, inshallah, will be joining us to share his, not just his experiences, but to make the case for Iran, as is entitled. So if you could welcome Mr. Jeremy Corbyn MP with a loud salawat.
Good afternoon, peace be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me today to speak here in this wonderful centre. I have been here before, and I think it's wonderfully sited at the border between wealthy Westminster and Kilburn. It's absolutely brilliant the way this centre acts as a bridge between two parts of London. And it's a great honour to be able to come here today and speak to you, and I will be as brief as I can, and our chair is going to ask me to cease in good time so we don't run too long. When the director, thank you so much, spoke in opening this conference, I thought it was a very interesting address, and it's one that I wish a much larger number of people in this country could have heard, because he was describing the history and traditions of Islam, but he was also describing the inclusivity, the tolerance and the acceptance of other faiths, other traditions and other ethnic groupings within Iran. And I think that's something that most people in the West simply do not understand. And my point is that we need to have a much more significant understanding of the history of Iran and Britain's relations with Iran if we're to bring about a new chapter in relations that I hope are going to bring about peace. Now, I approach this whole issue from the point of view that I am committed to a world free of nuclear weapons. I joined the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament when I was aged 15, long before I joined anything else. I've been in it all my life, and I will be in it for the rest of my life, because I think weapons of mass destruction that indiscriminately kill civilians are immoral, wrong, and nobody, including this country, should possess nuclear weapons. That's where I'm coming from on this subject. And secondly, I am one of the founders, as well as the current chair, of the Stop the War Coalition, and in that context I was strongly opposed and remain opposed to British involvement in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the bombardment of Libya and a whole foreign policy that seems to decide that the Western powers, namely some of the European countries plus the United States, have some sort of moral authority to invade and rule the rest of the world. They do not, they should not, and I want to see a world free of wars and free of invasion, rather than preparing for yet another war and another invasion. But I also think that in trying to understand the history of Iran and the significance of the revolution in 1979, when we had a debate on Iran in Parliament last year, I started talking about Britain's involvement through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, through the First World War, through the Second World War, through the coup in 1952, the rule of the Shah and the abuses of human rights that occurred under him, and the support he received. And somebody who should know better said to me, "Oh, that's all irrelevant, that's all in the past." I'm sorry. The problems of today stem from the history of relations and the history of European relations with all the countries in the region. All those straight lines on maps all over the Middle East were drawn around the table in Versailles in 1918 and 1919, and we're still paying the price for that, just as much as throughout Africa. All those straight lines on maps that divide ethnic communities, divide linguistic communities, are drawn on maps around a table in Berlin in 1884, when the rest of the world thought it could divide up Africa in its interests. And so we have to understand why history is the way that it is. Now, British interest in Persia, as it was, came about because of an obsession with controlling routes to the empire, particularly India. It also came about because of technology. The technological change of the British Navy, changing from being oil-fired steam ships to coal-fired steamships to oil-fired steamships, meant they had to have a source of oil. And since at that time they didn't think there was any oil in Britain, but they knew there was a lot of oil in that region, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was founded, and Churchill himself took it into public ownership in 1908, well before the First World War, and formed British Petroleum, and BP has been around for a very long time and had an enormous influence. And when I visited Iran, and I'll come back to that in a moment, a few weeks ago, I went to the British Embassy. It is enormous. I didn't realise how big it was. This massive, beautiful garden in the grounds, and these huge residences and the buildings that go with it. And you realise this was almost the centre of colonial government for a very long time. This wasn't just an embassy in the sense of being an office. This was something else. And British influence in Iran has not always been good, has not always been for the good of the people of Iran, but has very much been in the interests of both Britain's colonial policy as well as the interests of British commerce. And so when the coup took place in 1952, inspired by Britain and the United States against the wishes of the people of Iran, that brought in the regime of the Shah and brought in the secret police and brought in a very large number of Iranian people seeking exile in this country and other countries in Europe. And as a young man living in London from the early 70s onwards, I was always struck by the huge Iranian community in London, and there is a very large Iranian community in London now, and it's my privilege to represent those that live in my area in Parliament. Indeed, there are estimated to be 300,000 Iranian people living in Britain. And so we then had the isolation of Iran, we've had the sanctions against Iran, we've had the military threats against Iran, we've had the demonization of Iran, and we had the horrors of the Iran-Iraq war, when the West poured arms into Iraq, and that war cost 500,000 lives and a great deal of devastation. And who benefited from that war? Mainly those that supplied arms and weapons to both sides in that conflict. And I was one of the very few people in Parliament in the 1980s to raise the question of the use of chemical weapons, to raise the question of what happened in Halabja, and to raise the question of the arms supplies that were going to Iraq, despite the record of Saddam Hussein and others in Iraq. And I was told by a number of people I shouldn't be raising these issues because it was damaging to Britain's interests. I'm sorry, it's not a question of what you perceive to be Britain's commercial interests are, it's a question of what you perceive to be the best route to achieve peace and understanding in the future is, and I do not believe supplying weaponry is the way to bring about that peace and understanding in the future. And so we've had then the issue coming on, I'll be brief on this, coming on has been Iran's development and future. Now, I come at this perspective on the nuclear issue as being, A, somebody that is totally opposed to the existence of nuclear weapons of any form by anybody. And secondly, I am not personally a supporter of nuclear power because I think there are huge problems about disposal of nuclear waste and the safety issue. But I recognise in international law it is perfectly permissible for any country to be a civilian nuclear power in the sense they can enrich uranium in order to generate electricity from it, because it requires a heat source to generate electricity. I recognise that. I also recognise that Iran was and remains and intends to remain a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has two fundamental parts to it. The first is that all those who sign it who do not possess nuclear weapons at the time of signing agree they will never possess nuclear weapons. Secondly, and this is the part that's often forgotten, the 5 declared nuclear weapons states, Russia, France, Britain, China and the United States, also agree that they will take steps towards disarmament and will not encourage nuclear weapons in any other state. There are two parts to this treaty, and I have attended numerous nuclear non-proliferation treaty review conferences and preparatory committees for those review conferences, and the last but one conference there was an agreement that there should be a convention on a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, to which obviously Iran and the other countries would come, but Israel, as the only state in the region that has nuclear weapons, that is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, would also attend. The failure of the Finnish government and the leadership of the NPT to organise this conference is in danger of damaging the whole process, and indeed Egypt walked out last year from the conference but not from the treaty. And so I think that the interesting events that have happened over the past 6 months provide us, and I'll conclude with this, with a period of great hope. One was the change approach by Britain to not getting involved in the war in Syria, and I was one that voted emphatically against Britain getting militarily involved in Syria, not because I want the war to continue, but because I want there to be peace, and I could not see how anything would be improved by Britain and America getting involved in bombing Syria. What we need is a Geneva II process with every country around the table, including Iran, in order to bring about, 1, a ceasefire, and 2, a permanent settlement, so we don't allow this dreadful war to carry on with the 2 million refugees, the 100,000 who've already died, and the devastation of so many people's lives. We need peace in that region, and it would not come about by yet more Western involvement. It will come about through a peace conference. The second is the involvement of Iran has helped to bring about the chemical weapons agreement with the Syrian government, has helped to bring about Geneva II taking place, and I do believe that the interim agreement that's been reached on nuclear processing with Iran is a very good step forward, and I fervently hope that in 6 months' time we'll have the final agreement. I also recognise that Iran is a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which I also attend, and Iran, like every other country, must undergo its universal periodic review. Every country has to undergo it, and I raised these questions with the Foreign Minister during our visit, and the assurance was given that the full response will be given at the UN Human Rights Council in June, as is required. The message I got from my visit was that Iran is a country that is strong, a country with the most amazing history, and a country that has suffered very grievously during the Iran-Iraq War. And I met victims of chemical weapons attacks, and I visited the Peace Museum in Tehran to undertake discussions with friends there. Our delegation was a parliamentary delegation, not a government delegation. And whilst there are enormous differences of opinion with those four of us on the delegation on many other issues, we were agreed that we want to rebuild normal, proper, good relations with Iran, which means an end of sanctions, full diplomatic recognition, proper visa arrangements, and an end to the financial sanctions, which are so damaging to Iranian families and everything else. What's the future of the world? Are we to go down yet more wars? Are we going to go down the route of more destruction and more hatred growing up between peoples? Or are we to bring up our children to understand our history, understand the principles of Islam as one would understand the principles of every other faith, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and understand there is a commonality of humanity, there is a commonality of understanding, there is a commonality of acceptance. But if we teach our children that history is all about conquering, all about controlling, all about exploiting, and all about exploiting each other's natural resources, then we're in for a world where environmental damage gets worse, where security interests get worse, and the only profiteers are those that make the weapons of war. I respect Iran's history. I respect what brought about the revolution in 1979. And I hope I understand the need and wish of the people of Iran to have a peaceful relationship with the rest of the world. I want our children in this country not to be brought up in a history of grand imperial Britain. I want them to be brought up in understanding the world in which we live and the possibilities of living in a world at peace. That surely, in London of all cities, is something we can all share and agree with. It was my pleasure to go to Iran, and I'm very much looking forward to returning, and I have been invited to go again to talk about British politics and all that sort of thing to help bring that understanding of both of our countries. Thank you very much for the honour of inviting me today.